Hi everyone. I know this is a bit of a long video, but Muslim terrorism is a pretty serious topic, so I thought I'd do it justice. If you want to skip ahead to specific chapters, then just look in the video description for timelines. Otherwise, crack open a beer and listen to my soothing Swedish accent, yeah? You're gonna need it, yeah? We're gonna head into some pretty dark places. But then we're gonna top it off with some constructive ideas on how to make the world a better place, so you don't end up suicidal. On the 7th of April, Rakhmat Akilov stole a truck and killed 5 people, injuring 14 others. One of the deceased is an 11-year-old girl. The remaining 4 casualties were citizens from Belgium, Britain and Sweden. One, a 66-year-old woman who was a politician for the Green Party. The terrorist originally intended for the truck to explode when he crashed into the building, but the device didn't go off as planned, so he escaped and was later caught, in large part thanks to security cameras. He was finally arrested in Märsta, a Swedish ghetto and hotbed for Muslim radicalization. In fact, one of the masterminds behind the Paris attacks in 2015 was a previous resident in this exact population area. The terrorist has admitted to his crimes and was given one of the best lawyers in Sweden, but refused this defense, saying he wants a Sunni Muslim instead. Oy vey. What many people don't know is that this isn't the first time ISIS has attacked Sweden. In 2010, there was a failed suicide bombing in Stockholm. The perpetrator was trained in Mosul by a group called the Islamic State of Iraq, who at that current time weren't very known amongst the public. Now, the most important question here is, could this have been prevented? And the answer is yes, very easily. You're gonna be baffled as we get into this later on in the video. Like, your jaw is gonna drop at how our politicians fail to take the most basic precautions to protect their nation. But first, let's take a look at some of the reactions from Swedish people to this terrorist attack. You know, leftists, feminists, politicians, and so on. Well, that's completely fucking perverse. People have died here and you're dancing around happy? What are you celebrating? Showing respect for a tragedy starts by admitting it's a tragedy and allowing people to grieve. You don't respond with joy just because you're so fucking weak that you can't handle negativity in your life. This isn't about the victims. You just want to pretend that everything is fine and stick your head in the clouds so you can suppress the negative emotions. But essentially, this is like going to a funeral, dancing and smiling and holding up signs going, "Well, free love!" Negative emotions are beacons for our values. Anger and bitterness are moral claims. It's justified outrage over injustice. Love and acceptance has no role in a situation like this. I mean, seriously, if you don't react with resentment in a situation like this, you clearly don't take human rights seriously. And it's not the action per se that I'm against here. You know, if you want to stand somewhere and hand out hugs, that's fine. It's more about the timing. You could at least have waited a week, but now the corpses barely had time to be collected before people started shouting forced cliches about unconditional love. Let me put it this way. This is not what the victims' families are looking like right about now. You have the privilege to be capable of feeling joy. They do not. So show some fucking respect. A leading social democrat and former member of parliament said that love is an important tool to fight terrorism. Love can only beat terrorism if it has lots of guns. You ever stop to think what would have happened if we tried to face Hitler with love and openness? Sweden's parliament would have looked like this right about now. These Muslim terrorists are the kind of people that, had they heard about Auschwitz during World War II, they would have used their Swedish welfare to travel down there and participate in the Holocaust. Do we really want to love them and try to understand them and tolerate them? Can't we just fucking stop them? Let me quote this brilliant article by Jim Goad on why globalism is cancer. John Lennon can be fairly viewed as the first pop star globalist, and his naive 1971 hit Imagine is venerated as a globalist anthem. He imagined a world with no countries, no private property, no murder, and universal cooperation. While he was imagining all this, a crazy fan pulled out a gun and blew Lennon's brains out. Lennon sang that all we needed was love. What he needed that night was a gun. You know, I can't put it any better than that. All this bullshit about love and openness is designed to make people forget about the tragedy here and who's responsible for it. It's normalizing terrorism. We should not go on as usual. We should demand change. And openness is what allowed more than 100 jihadis back into Sweden after fighting for ISIS, and the government's plan of dealing with them was to give them driver's licenses, jobs and housing. Imagine if they had done the same to SS soldiers. Clearly, this policy isn't working. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, Duterte is cracking down on terrorists with such extreme brutality that a leader who's been on the FBI's most wanted list for years voluntarily surrendered. There's something to learn there. At this rate, a family of wild boars are more effective in fighting ISIS than all of Sweden's government. A recent poll showed that the terror attack on Drottninggatan made Swedish people even more positive to the direction that Sweden is heading. I'm not winging this is literally what the fuck it's saying. An opinion poll before the terror attack showed that 43% of Sweden thinks the country is heading into the wrong direction, while 32% were positive. After the terror attack, 41% are negative, and the percentage who feel that Sweden is on the right path has increased to 37%. It is primarily women and left-wingers who are feeling more positive, and the company responsible for this study thinks that this increase is due to how the terror attack was handled by authorities. Let me just say this. Each and every one of you are complete fucking idiots. Our authorities didn't prevent this attack, they allowed it to happen through limp-dick policies. What kind of insane upside-down perspective are you looking through here? Our Prime Minister has been in charge for 3 years knowing that deportations aren't working. But he didn't do shit about it, and now when people have died, he fakes frustration. He could have made important changes right after the IKEA murders that would have prevented this attack, but he did not. But we're gonna get into that in a minute. We're gonna get into how this could have been prevented. First, let me just read some more insane Swedish reactions. The store that was smashed by the truck, Åhléns, had a smoke sale where they sold all the terrorist damaged clothing for half the price. Oh. This really isn't the time for corporate trolling, don't you think? One of Sweden's biggest newspapers used the terror attack to try and pick up customers. Right as the attack was taking place, their editorial development chief tweeted, "Subscribe to our newsletter and find out every new detail about the terror attack through email." In fact, the mainstream media was so eager to report fresh details on the killings that they published blatantly wrong, unverified statements, such as shootings that never actually took place. We're talking about Sweden's biggest mainstream papers here. This really should indicate what type of mindset that the media is in. Journalists see corpses as opportunities. By the way, make sure to check out the movie Nightcrawler with Jake Gyllenhaal. It's the best depiction of the mainstream media that I've ever seen. Right next to a Serbian film. The same Swedish newspaper that published a picture of a dead 3-year-old wrote a long post on how morally wrong it is to share pictures of that 11-year-old victim in the terrorist attack. So pictures of dead kids are fine, so long as you're trying to make people feel guilty about not taking in enough immigrants. Otherwise, it's deeply immoral. Is that your moral high ground here? And let me just be really clear. All the people who posted pictures of that dead girl on social media and stuff, you're fucking disgusting. Have some respect for the deceased and their relatives, okay? You're just as gross as the media. I don't give a fuck how valid you think your agenda is. you're just vultures, just like the media. Our public service state media says that terrorism exists because of poverty. Gypsies are the poorest people in Europe. Why aren't they doing terror attacks? Sweden has 250,000 senior citizens living below the poverty line. Why aren't they killing infidels? Marxist theory dictates that material conditions decide moral values. So, put simply, if you're poor, you'll get shitty values and do bad things. And this left-wing nonsense permeates the entire media and the entire public debate. I mean, it's advertised constantly. Whenever non-whites do something bad, leftists want to cast the blame on exclusion and poverty, just like their Marxist religion taught them. But class analysis doesn't really explain why engineers are overrepresented as jihadists. Nor does it explain why bin Laden, who was born into a rich family, became a terrorist. Wahhabism as an ideology exists independently of socio-economical differences. Let me remind you of ISIS's own words from their official magazine, The Beak. We hate you first and foremost because you are disbelievers. We hate you because your secular liberal societies permit the very things that Allah has prohibited while banning many of the things He has permitted. Your secular liberalism has led you to tolerate and even support gay rights, to allow alcohol, drugs, fornication, gambling, and usury to become widespread, and to encourage the people to mock those who denounce these filthy sins and vices. And even if you were to stop bombing us, imprisoning us, torturing us, vilifying us, and usurping our lands, we would continue to hate you, because our primary reason for hating you will not cease to exist until you embrace Islam. Even if you were to pay jizya and live under the authority of Islam in humiliation, we would continue to hate you. No doubt would we stop fighting you as we would stop fighting any disbelievers who enter into a covenant with us, but we would not stop hating you. You know, when you read this stuff, they genuinely seem offended by left-wing journalists because they literally made an entire chapter devoted to proving this point, where they call out journalists and politicians for being politically correct. So, yeah, seems like ISIS completely agrees with the alt-right here. Huh. Public service media also had a scientist on to say that terrorism is so common now in Europe that what happened in Stockholm probably isn't gonna affect tourism negatively. Yeah, because money is the really important thing here. It's not the Swedish people's lives. No. It's the profit that capitalists can make selling silly hats. Tourism. Fucking tourism. Also, very comforting to hear that terrorism is the new normal now. That's really a good sign, huh? That people have just gotten used to random mass murders. Wasn't really like this in Europe 50 years ago or so. I guess you have multiculturalism to thank there. This other major newspaper wants to ban cars because they can be used to kill people. Yeah, why don't we just ban living? Because life can be a gateway to death. Hizb ut-Tahrir is a radical Islamist organization. They can basically be described as a peaceful version of ISIS. This is an organization that the terrorists sympathized with. They're banned in Germany, Russia, China, Egypt, Turkey, and all but 3 Arab countries. But not in Sweden. They're very welcome in Sweden. And they made a statement on the terror attack, encouraging Muslims not to condemn the attack, since Muslims shouldn't feel stigmatized. Which is pretty much the same thing that the feminist parties said. They used the attack to talk about how Islamophobia grows larger after every Muslim terrorist attack. Gee, I wonder why. Then she tells people to vote for her party. That's classy. So, Islamists and feminists have the same problem focus? It is not the terrorism that should be defeated, or the ideas behind this religious violence, but rather it's the reaction to this violence that is the real problem here. That's what's worth focusing on the most. Huh. Imagine that. In the city of Umeå, the Red Cross and Refugees Welcome held a manifestation against racism and violence. Why not a manifestation against Islamism and violence, you cowardly pieces of shit? What, you don't have the balls to differentiate between Islamists and Muslims? That's kind of racist, if anything. We can't allow the terror attack to turn us racist. I kind of feel like we shouldn't allow terrorists to kill us would have been a better title. And what you call racism probably would have prevented the terror attack. That is to say, border controls and stuff. Donald Trump responded by offering assistance in the investigation. So a politician outside of Sweden is more concerned than the ones in Sweden? Now here's something really kinky. Just 2 days after people were killed in Stockholm, a bunch of journalists pulled together a manifestation for love where they preached openness and multiculturalism. Discrimination in Sweden was described as a widespread issue, and 2 rappers asked people to think about everyone in Syria and Africa. So not even when Sweden gets attacked, we're allowed to focus just on Sweden. Instead, we need to have a globalist perspective. It's all about them refugees. The word terror attack was mentioned once throughout all of these 20 minutes. And the word Islamism wasn't mentioned once. The remainder of the time was spent on tired clichés.
Jag vägrar att acceptera ett mer stängt och intolerant samhälle.
Vi är spridda över hela världen, men vi är i ständig kontakt. Are you okay dear? Ständigt. Vi är sanna kosmopoliter som hör hemma överallt och ingenstans. Det finns de som ser vår existens i Stockholm, Berlin, London eller Melbourne som ett hot. Men de människorna, de kommer bara ha tillfälliga segrar. I längden har de redan förlorat.
Sarah Daw Finer tweeted saying that ISIS and the Sweden Democrats are the exact same threat. This is the definition of relativizing terror. How are you gonna compare mass murdering pedophiles to a group of ordinary nationalists, which for that matter are the 3rd biggest party in Sweden because the Swedish people elected them to be? How the fuck are you gonna stand there and preach love when you compare terrorists to those who believe in democracy? That's really perverse, if anything. And perhaps worst of all, the very politicians who laid the foundation for this terrorist attack were invited to participate in a silent minute when the Sweden Democrats suggested that jihadists with foreign citizenships should be deported. The Minister of Interior declined their proposal. Here he is at the manifestation, standing right next to Karin Vangård, one of the people responsible for the Stockholm strategy, which said that returning jihadists should be given welfare, jobs and housing in order to de-radicalize them. I repeat, the woman who wanted to reward terrorists with welfare was a speaker at this event. The strategy she put forward also said that organizations connected to the Muslim Brotherhood would be given a vital role in preventing radicalization. This catastrophic strategy was later retracted after massive criticism. So obviously not everyone in Sweden is a complete moron. But this was in 2015. By March of 2017, they still hadn't come up with a new action plan against terrorism. How fucking hard should that be? I put one together in the latter half of this video, and I'm not even a politician. In 1996, the Green Party demanded that the National Security Police be abolished and all their powers removed. 12 years later, in 2007, they once again attacked the National Security Police for harassing Muslims and enabling Islamophobia. In 2011, barely a year after the failed suicide bombing in Stockholm, the Green Party criticized the decision to give the National Security Police 100 million extra in funding to prevent terrorism. And since the Green Party came into power in 2014, they've increased the funding to an Islamist organization with 148%. Relativizing terrorism and Islamism is the Green Party's tradition, and here's their representative participating in a silent minute for the victims. You don't get more perverse than this. Now, let's get to the most important question here. What can we do to prevent things like this from happening again? Well, let's go over the facts. The perpetrator was an illegal immigrant from Uzbekistan who had been sentenced to deportation in June of 2016. He was wanted in his home country for crimes connected to religious extremism. He attempted to join ISIS in Syria in 2015, but was detained and deported back to Sweden, even though he's not a citizen in Sweden. So, we're just a dumping ground for other countries' problems now. Akilov said that his attack was an order from ISIS, and Uzbekistan had previously warned Sweden that he was indeed a potential terrorist. But our national security police didn't act on it, and as of now, they refuse to explain why. But worth noting in this context is that SAPO, the National Security Police of Sweden, only have about 1,000 employees, and merely 250 of those are directly involved with counter-terrorism. That number is far less than all of the potential security threats in Sweden that they have to keep an eye on, both jihadists, Nazis, and Antifa cuckolds. And this is pretty much the only people in the entire country working to prevent terrorism. So clearly they need more funding as well as efforts to give them more staff. Also worth mentioning is that the globalist project, the European Union, has made it impossible for Sweden to deport suspected terrorists. Thanks to the European Convention on Human Rights, Sweden isn't allowed to deport people who risk capital punishment or torture in their home countries, even when these people are ISIS terrorists. It also applies to rapists, murderers, and war criminals. This article from 2016 interviewed a representative from the Migration Board who said that we think it's more important to protect single individuals from being punished with death or torture. In plain text, what this means is we don't give a shit about Swedish people. They're not important here. Human rights is what's important here. Human rights for people who don't even deserve to be here in the first place. That's what's essential. Obviously, the Declaration of Human Rights needs to be abolished because it's not actually about human rights. And it's clearly a violation of the Swedish people's rights to their own country and to national security. And the European Union needs to go as well, because all it really does is enable free movement for criminals and terrorists. We don't need centralized international corporate fascism to conduct trade with other countries. That's just ridiculous. The European Union does not benefit ordinary people, and thus it does not deserve to exist. The number of refugees classified as threats towards national security nearly doubled last year. Throughout all of 2016, the Migration Board alerted the National Security Police twice a day about potential terrorists. That's 2 new unique reports every day for a full year. And thus far in 2017, that number is even higher, rating up to 2.5 unique terrorist threats per day. And since these people cannot be deported, many of them remain in Sweden as free men. And I quote, "There is no strategy for how to deal with these people." So people who are considered too dangerous to be given residence permits are allowed to roam Sweden freely as if they were legal citizens. A Salafist group known for terror recruiting are having a conference in Malmö. Nobody cares. Radicals can just preach in the streets here, and Swedes are too fucking ignorant to know what's going on, because the fear of racism makes them unable to differentiate secular Muslims from Islamists. I mean, after the terror attack, our public service media invited 2 Islamists to represent Muslims and talk about the Islamophobia they're experiencing now. Swedish journalists haven't learned shit, and they're a part of this problem, because they're the ones who are legitimizing radicals. They're giving them a platform. They're allowing them to operate as officials. We need to call the media out on this, and we need to do it on a regular basis. And let's make this very clear. Both the right wing and the left wing are at fault here. In 2011, the right-wing government cooperated with the Green Party to give illegal immigrants the same rights as legal immigrants, giving them free access to schooling, dental care, and health care. In effect, the result of this was that illegal immigrants ended up paying less for dental care than Swedish citizens, and thus the incentive to become a citizen disappeared, since illegals are treated even better than legals. And when the left-wing government took over in 2014, several major cities communists took it a step further, giving entire families welfare and free housing. Also worth noting is that whoever manages to stay underground as an illegal for 4 years can reapply for asylum after that time period. Recently, the cops did a raid against illegals in southern Sweden, and a representative for the Left Party was against this, since he claims it violated basic human rights. How the fuck is it human rights to gain free access to another country's welfare system? Sweden's prime minister said in 2014 that Sweden will never become a sanctuary for terrorists, and yet that's exactly what Sweden is. In the 3 years that passed since then, he did absolutely nothing to prevent a terrorist attack. Returning jihadists were supposed to be treated with welfare, and all suggestions to ban them from re-entering the country were dismissed as racism. The terrorist in Stockholm wasn't illegal. So was the African who killed a Swedish mother and her son at IKEA in 2015. The African made sure to pick white people as victims because it was revenge for not being granted a residence permit. You just don't get any more self-entitled than that. He was supposed to be deported too, but he wasn't, because Sweden rarely locks up those who've gotten deportation verdicts. They will just tell someone that they have to leave, but they won't actually do anything to enforce it. It doesn't take a genius to realize that these killings could have been avoided had we treated illegals as illegals, but both the political left and right made sure that they remained, and both were critics of the police rev-up project. For those who don't know, this is basically internal border controls, where the cops approach someone who looks non-Swedish and asks them for ID. If it turns out they're illegal, they would be deported immediately. This was a very effective operation against illegal immigrants, but the mainstream media with their white upper-class cultural elite carried out a fierce campaign to label the police as racist, fascist, Nazis for daring to ask people for their IDs because this is racial profiling. You're technically treating people differently according to skin color. If your definition of anti-racism is to not help the cops catch criminals and illegals, then I don't want anti-racism. I want law and order instead. And I don't care if that makes me a fascist. Why are you acting as if this is such an unreasonable request? Like, why are you acting as if it's some kind of holocaust to ask people to just take half a minute out of your day and help the police catch criminals? And just show your ID. Why even make it into such a big thing? I do it. If the cops came up to me and were like, "Hey there, boy, your nose looks kind of foreign. Let me see some ID." I'd go, If you ask me, that's not a big thing to give up in order for national security and law and order to exist in your country. It's not harassment. And I don't care if it's racial profiling, because sometimes racial profiling makes sense. It's just obvious that Swedish is an ethnicity and it's a white ethnicity. Really, really reasonable to assume that if you see someone who looks white and Swedish, they're probably not from Africa. I mean, if that's your definition of racism, you're a fucking idiot. And racism now is just common sense. I'm not saying that immigrants shouldn't feel welcome. I am saying that recognizing differences doesn't automatically lead to racism. But the social justice warriors got exactly what they wanted, because the police ended up dropping these ID controls. They've been cut in half the past 5 years, despite the fact that they're essential to locating and deporting wanted criminals. Now keep this in mind. There's 12,500 other illegals roaming around freely. 75% of convicted criminals with deportation sentences stay behind in Sweden. After their time in prison, they're just released and nobody knows where they are. There is no law and order in this country. More than 4 out of 5 convicted immigrant rapists aren't even deported. And with 40% of murders, there's no deportation either. This is where globalism gets you. The idea that since nations shouldn't exist, you are entitled to other people's countries. You don't have the right to borders because nation states are fascist. So let's just import rapists and murderers and terrorists because everyone is equal, man. Stop being so problematic. People are just the same. You're not better than a terrorist pedophile. Stop being chauvinist. Nations are just a social construct anyway, so why should politicians care about their own people? That's racist. Everyone is people. Sweden needs to build a wall. So here's some troubling stats. 50% of those seeking asylum register different identities with different agencies. The terrorist was just one of many who exploited this system and had double identities. And a recent report showed that the market for fake IDs is widespread in Sweden. The media interviewed an illegal immigrant who sells ID papers for a living, and he says that the police are completely absent in the underworld of Stockholm. In fact, he feels so confident in this illegal trade of his that he even publishes his phone number openly in ads on the internet. And according to his speculation, fake IDs and different identities is happening in 70% of all workplaces he's aware of. Sweden's huge immigration costs more than the entire national defense, more than our military. This really says it all about our priorities as a nation. We barely have a military, and in this entire country there's only about 20,000 cops. Our security as a nation is a joke. And even after this terrorist attack, the government denied the police extra funding. It's not illegal to be a member of ISIS in Sweden. You're perfectly allowed to join them in Syria, and unless the government explicitly finds a video of you cutting someone's head off, you won't be prosecuted when you return. The National Security Police doesn't even have the right to interrogate you unless you feel like it. So obviously, they need to be given more power and authority. Terrorists in Sweden are essentially protected by the same law as Boy Scouts, namely the right to start a fraternity or organization. So in Sweden, if you grab a guy by the ass, it will have bigger legal consequences than joining ISIS. Technically, it is illegal with terror trips to Syria, but in reality, it's near impossible to prosecute. Only 2 people have been convicted thus far, and that's only because they actually found a video of them decapitating people. Sweden is a sanctuary for terrorists, whereas in Norway they criminalized collaboration with terrorism, which forced the jihadist environment to disappear. Norway has less than a third as many jihadists as Sweden, but convicts far more. In Sweden, it's essentially risk-free to be a militant Islamist. But thankfully, Sweden is now looking at taking after Norway's legislation, so that would be a step forward, albeit a step taken in way too slow of a pace. There is absolutely no point to this politically correct nervousness. Failure to act in time has claimed many innocent lives. In fact, Sweden has been exporting terrorism since the 90s. Even before 9/11, jihadists were traveling back and forth to Al-Qaeda's training camp in Afghanistan. And leaders within Al-Qaeda, as well as Al-Shabaab, have had their bases and recruitment business in Sweden. Our politicians, with their relaxed attitude towards Islamism, has claimed many innocent lives all over the world, not just in Sweden. And a report recently by the agency under the Ministry of Defense showed that the Muslim Brotherhood has been active in Sweden since the 70s, and they've grown thanks to secular support from the political left. Professor Aya Kolbum discovered 17 years ago that there's Islamists radicalizing Muslims in the ghettos. He was called racist and Islamophobic. Had his research been taken seriously, we could have saved many people's lives. International terrorism expert Magnus Ranstorp explicitly said that left-wing academics sabotaged the fight against terrorism and set progress back by 7 years. And our government is funding Islamism while being outraged at the results of Islamism. Over the years, there's been numerous reports of organizations and mosques being given state funding despite the fact that they invite ISIS sympathizers to hold lectures and generally preach radical messages. Sweden is essentially throwing money at anyone who calls themselves a Muslim representative and doesn't even carefully audit them first. It should be the other way around. Ranstorp said in an interview that ISIS jihadists are basically funded by Swedish welfare and fundraisers. Attendance allowance frauds is also a huge business for organized crime. There is no effective auditing authority for institutions and fraternities, so there needs to be one. And generally, he's advocating that Sweden adapts the Danish model. Link in the video description if you want to learn more about how that works. But I'm sure Sweden would consider the Danish model to be racist. So therefore I suggest that we become racist. Because apparently Racism means common sense. But it's not just our government who's funding Islamism. Norway's former ambassador to Saudi Arabia claims that they're a major player when it comes to spreading radical Islamism across Europe. But very few people want to talk about this. And according to Aya Kolbum, they've been doing this ever since the 70s. Saudi Arabia is funding various institutions all over the world so they can preach the Saudi ideology of Wahhabism, which is the most strict and unforgiving interpretation of Islam. In Germany, their domestic intelligence agency accused Gulf groups of funding mosques, religious schools, hardline preachers, and conversion groups called Dawah to spread the ideology. A report as far back as 2005 showed that this is happening in Sweden as well. Pretty much every Muslim congregation in the entire country had been contacted by Saudi financiers, and many felt uncomfortable accepting that money because it was made apparent that they would only get money in exchange for certain demands. So many congregations declined. Belgium has one hell of a problem with terrorism. The highest per capita export of Muslim terrorists in all of Europe. Almost 20,000 Belgian citizens are suspected of ties to terrorism. In 2010, that number was almost 2,000. So that's a crazy increase. And worth noting in this context is following. A WikiLeaks disclosure found that in April of 2012, the Belgian government quietly forced Saudi authorities to remove the main director of the Great Mosque. He was suspected of propagating the same ideology as the Islamic State. Michael Privet of the Brussels-based European Network Against Racism said in an interview, "Today in Brussels, 95% of the courses offered on Islam for Muslims are operated by young preachers trained in Saudi Arabia. There is a huge demand within Muslim communities to know about their religion, but most of the offer is filled by a very conservative Salafist type of Islam, sponsored by Saudi Arabia." And the same goes for America. I'm gonna link sources in the video description for those who want to learn even more, but you get the picture. Norway's ambassador suggested that one method of countering extremism is to ban certain oppressive regimes from funding political and religious institutions. I agree with that, along with another proposal. Cease all funding for religious institutions, period. Religion is an intellectual cancer that has no place in a secular, civilized society. And if it absolutely must exist, then it should exist in the privacy of your own home. People's tax money shouldn't be funding it. There's absolutely no point in funding flawed ideas. But if you disagree with this, then I think we can both at least agree that it would be a good idea if the government were to hire someone with the right heritage and right language skills to go undercover in mosques, just visit them and see what type of opinions are being preached. Restaurants are monitored in this fashion. They do random checkups and see that hygiene conditions are fine, so why not do the same with mosques? I mean, if you're receiving thousands and thousands in state funding from the government, then you better prove that you're worth it as well. Now, the following is very important to point out, because whenever terrorism occurs, the government tries to use it to increase their general control over people's minds. They suggest furthering the surveillance state. But mass surveillance wouldn't have prevented this terrorist attack because it doesn't work. There's not a shred of evidence to back up that notion. And not only that, but it actually makes it harder to catch terrorists. Because all it does is create an overabundance of data, making it harder to pinpoint the actual threats. Keep in mind that national security agencies have limited resources, and terrorists are rare. So finding one is a needle in a haystack problem. And you don't make it easier by throwing unnecessary hay onto the stack. What works is focused surveillance and good old-fashioned detective work, not mass surveillance of innocent citizens. The NSA is a huge program and it has not managed to stop a single terrorist attack. The Charlie Hebdo terrorists were already known to French authorities. They were considered a serious threat, and France has blanket electronic surveillance, but that didn't change anything. I don't want terrorism nor a surveillance state, and more people need to be concerned about both, because as it is right now, we're heading into a direction where ordinary nationalists and critics of the government might become classified as terrorists. Criticizing migration is becoming criminal hate speech in certain countries. The so-called war on terrorism is a smokescreen to infringe the rights of those who criticize the establishment. So when counteracting terrorism, terrorism, we need to be vigilant not to enforce legislations that can be used against mere dissidents. And let's address the Muslim question. The absolute majority of the Islamic State's attacks are carried out in the Middle East. Do you see those barely visible grey lines? Yeah, that's the West, okay? That's Europe. Everything else is the Middle East. Muslims are the biggest victims here. ISIS hates Muslims. One of their magazine issues even ordered jihadists to kill ordinary Muslims. You can just imagine the purity checks that these guys have. Even fundamentalist Muslim countries hate ISIS. We must not buy into the whole divide and conquer narrative. Muslims are not the enemy here. Islamists and globalist politicians are. We need to direct our hate in the right direction, because otherwise we can't unite on a broad front and truly deal with the core issues here. Just think about the fact that the purpose of 9/11 was to provoke America into declaring war on the Muslim world and thereby awakening Muslims. Al-Qaeda considered this to be a success. So that's pretty interesting. Terrorists are not the friends of Muslims, and Muslims, if anyone, know what it's like to live with terror. You know who's friends with terrorists, though? America, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, since they funded ISIS. The United States even funded Al-Qaeda decades ago. If you want to end terrorism, then focus on the countries whose foreign policies create fertile ground for terrorism. This is obviously not just a religious problem. But it's also important to focus on the specific ideology here, because this is a powerful aspect. Ideology is what can lead a father of four to kill innocent people and then want to blow himself up, thinking he's the good guy. Ms. Hirsi Ali says that the West has made a colossal mistake by its obsession with terrorism. And I quote, "In focusing only on acts of violence, we've ignored the Islamist ideology underlying those acts. By not fighting a war of ideas against political Islam or Islamism and against those who spread it, we've committed a blunder." This is Sweden in a nutshell. Over the years, I've seen representatives for the Muslim Brotherhood invited into the mainstream media to speak on the behalf of Muslims. This despite the fact that most Muslims never chose them as representatives and never showed support. And still, they're being given state funding, helping them to cement influence. The terrorist said that he had killed infidels. He wasn't talking about whites or Swedish people. He used a specific religious terminology. So if we really think that Islam means peace, then we should ask every imam in all of Europe to get together and issue a statement where they problematize Islamic verses about infidels, kafirs, and so on, and have them flat out say that infidels and kafirs aren't worth less as people and absolutely cannot be killed in any circumstance. In fact, make this a fatwa and have it outright say that anyone who doesn't tolerate disbelievers and kills people will definitely go to hell. Since Islam means peace, equality, and justice, this type of demand from our politicians shouldn't be a problem whatsoever. I mean, all we're really asking you to do here is just clarify the message that's already there in the Quran, supposedly. That shouldn't be a problem, right? Just start preaching that only God can judge business and we good. What happened in Sweden already happened in other countries and worse. We need to change things before it's too late. Otherwise, we're heading into even bigger of a disaster. There's plenty of good people with good ideas who want to solve these issues. People like Magnus Ranstorp and Aya Karlbom. We need to give people like that support and help them gain influence. And don't vote for the same parties who contributed to this shit. Vote for the parties who come closest to common sense, which is close the borders. Close them until we've solved all problems related to immigration. And when you eventually open the borders again, make sure that immigration is always restricted, because otherwise you just don't have time and resources to do proper background checks. Build up Sweden's army. Bring back REVA controls. Make deportations mandatory for illegals and criminal immigrants. Stop funding religious institutions solutions. Hire more national security police. Stop surveillancing innocent masses of people and spend your efforts on focused surveillance instead. These are just a few ways to make Sweden safer. Is that really so hard? So write your politicians. Write your representatives, send them the sources I've used in this video, they can all be found in the video description, and tell them to get their shit together, because otherwise you're not gonna vote for them. And you're gonna tell everyone that you know why they shouldn't vote for them either. And that is how you pressure politicians, because your votes are their salary. Take that away and they don't have anything. Ordinary people can do something here. You are not powerless. Exercise the influence that you have and be patient, because nobody changes their mind overnight. Everything begins with awareness, so make people aware. And make sure to check out my video, The Islamization of Sweden, as well, because it has tons of information about how it got this bad. This video you've been watching now is just the tip of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg.